Good morning, everyone. Welcome back to Homiletics Church. How are we doing this morning? We are in week 3, actually, of our sermon series, where our amazing pastors have given us great words about the Playbook. Want to give them a hand real quick? Now, I'm starting off a bit lighter because today's topic is heavier than a lot of the ones that we might encounter throughout a regular sermon series. And that would be overcoming trauma, a word that we don't normally like to deal with or associate with. And I have right here a trauma dog. He is a dog that has experienced quite a bit of trauma in his day. He was a surrender pup, which is where we got him. And he is a good example of how a trauma can become a good service. But before I get to that, I also want to preface just a bit of what trauma is. I know. Now, trauma is very difficult to define, but it can take on many forms. Would that be physical abuse? It would be some type of sexual abuse, church hurt, or some type of spiritual strain, or even just people that have wronged us, people in our family that have hurt us and that have wronged us in different ways, that have harmed us in ways we might not even realize. Because while most people associate trauma with rape victims, or people that have had homes that are broken apart through divorce, or even people that have grown up across the world, not in our first world country, to countries that may not have the advantages that we do, that may not have the freedoms and resources that we enjoy daily in America. But trauma can take the form of anything that meets 2 essential requirements. So in order for something to be qualified as traumatic in your life, it must meet these 2 requirements. The first one being a feeling of helplessness and a sense of abandonment from the people that you trusted to take care of you. Now, the word trauma also is derived from a Greek word meaning wound. And this word is what I think is very suited for trauma, because trauma wounds us. It wounds our brains and it wounds our integration that we have. The reason why trauma is so such an underlying incident and one that is so destructive to us is it is a silent killer that affects our brain structure. Now, this is because as we're younger, and especially while we're developing, we need this thing from our parents called attunement. From our caregivers, where they're attuned to our needs, they're attuned to who we are, they're attuned to what we need in that moment. And if we don't receive that care at any given point in time, or we feel like they've abandoned us, that they've left us helpless, that experience becomes traumatic, no matter how big or how small that might seem in the grand scheme of things. Now, we also have to realize that we have all experienced trauma. And trauma can be big or small, but trauma is very real and it's very applicable. And I want to preface this by saying that no matter how big or how small your trauma might seem, if we have trauma, I want to preface by saying it is not your fault that you were not cared for, that that event happened to you, or even that you are being continually experienced, you have continually lingering effects from this experience. Because trauma can take the place of 3 symptoms. And this is how we really test if we have trauma. It must fit the symptoms of oftentimes problem with affect regulation, which is your ability to be able to regulate yourself and be able to process things completely. Such as when you were younger and say, you weren't invited to a friend's house. Even something small like that might have been the cause of trauma in your life, where you felt that you weren't invited, that you weren't allowed places. Second is problems with friendships or relationships, where you seem to have relationships that maybe don't last or that are intact at the same time. So what I mean by that is that problems with relationships can be in the form of you either have a lot of broken relationships in your history, or pieces that relationships maybe have never been broken on the converse side. Maybe they are so intact you don't feel the ability to express yourself. You don't have the ability to regulate or develop those relationships. And the third symptom is difficulty receiving kindness, care, or support from a loved one. Now, in the case of Maddox, he was a surrender dog at the age of 1. Around December of last year, he was submitted to a shelter where we would eventually find him a month later. But that experience is very traumatizing for him. It left him feeling the sense of abandonment. He now has separation anxiety and expresses that very much so, whether he needs to be close to his parents, he needs to be loved, or to receive the attention of his mom and I. Or the second we walk out of a room, if he's not with us, he panics. And that type of trauma has led him to react in such ways that most people would consider improper. But in reality, he's just scared. He hasn't been able to move past yet the traumatic experiences that his previous owners had imprinted on him. And that trauma is not his fault. But the reality of today is that he has to deal with that and grow up. And if that's true for such an amazing, good boy, and such a good boy that's a puppy, how much more is that true for us as Christians and as people walking through our everyday lives, when we're communicating with people, we're working with people, and those traumatic experiences have a way of coming out in ways we didn't even understand why that happened.
Yeah.
So the first part, or my first point, is that we need to be able to recognize our trauma, recognize those symptoms in our life. Where have we felt helpless before? Where have we felt abandoned? What reactions come out of us for those symptoms where we have problems with regulating ourselves? Say some type of traumatic, very horrible event such as the loss of a loved one, being turned down for that promotion at work, or being faced with conflict in friendships or relationships where you can't seem to get yourself still. Your heart's pumping, you don't know why you're having this reaction, but it's overreacting in your book. It's a reaction that you think does more than the situation merits. That is one key symptom of it. And another way to identify this in your own life is by looking at the relationships around you. Maybe there's a lot of brokenness in your relationships. Maybe you've allowed different relationships throughout your past to affect the relationships that you have with loved ones, such as finding a spouse, or even just friendships in general, where you were cheated on by that one guy, or that one girl never seemed to take you seriously, and because of that, you're never able to fully accept and move on that maybe that person does want to stay with you, or perhaps she is interested and you can't seem to get past the fact that you maybe are worth believing in. So what are some areas in your life that trauma could have arisen? What are elements in your story? That is a very key point, that we need to revisit our own stories and see where trauma has affected us and how that has affected our relationship with others, ourselves, and God, of course. And I'll give you an example. And not just with Maddox, but also with humans. And in my personal life, I grew up without mostly knowing a father because he left when I was young. And as far as I know, he's been imprisoned or is probably dead somewhere in an alley and is already gone. I don't know, but that's the heritage I've come from. That is something I have struggled with immensely throughout my life. That trauma of not having a father has allowed me and prevented me from pursuing healthy relationships with my stepdad. It has affected the way I view other people's fathers. It has affected the way that I view my own fatherhood and what I want from my own family. And the second point is to engage your story with kindness after you recognize your trauma. And I think this is very important, that you're able to engage your story in a healthy way. And probably the best biblical example that I was able to find of this is Jesus and Peter after he denied him on the cross 3 days prior. You see this story in John 21, where Peter comes to meet where Jesus comes to meet the man who would deny him 3 days prior. And what Jesus does is he appears to his disciples on their boat while they're fishing and saying, throw your net on this side, and they're able to catch fish. And the disciples would eventually come to realize this is the resurrected Savior. And how can that be? But Peter and Jesus would be able to sit down and talk while eating lunch. And this is what the story goes on to say in John chapter 21, we're in verses 15 through 19. You give me an amen when you're all there? Amen. Cool. The chapter begins with, when they had finished breakfast, Jesus said to Simon Peter, Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these? Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these? And I want to highlight that more than these really quick, because most scholars will debate whether or not Jesus is referring to the disciples right next to him, or whether that would be the fish and material things that they just caught. But I think that Jesus is engaging Peter's story here in his problem with his appearance, with how he wanted to appear before others. And just chapters before this, Jesus would ask his disciples, while they were still together and while he was still alive, who do you all say that I am? And Peter rose up, boldest among his brothers, and would say, you are the Christ, the Son of God. And then Jesus would give him the name, you are Peter, Petros, the rock on which I would build my church. And now chapters later, after Peter would deny Jesus, and after he would walk through that trauma, that shame that he would keep beating himself up with, Jesus meets him here and says, do you love me more than these? Do you love me more than that appearance that you had when I was dying on the cross? Do you love me more than that boldness that would allow you to appear the first among your brothers? Do you love me more than just what you seem to think of yourself and what you want to portray yourself as others to be? And then he would continue in the chapter to say, he said to him, yes, Lord, meaning Peter. Yes, Lord, you know that I love you. He said to him, this being Jesus, feed my lambs. And Jesus said to him a second time, Simon, son of John, do you love me? Peter would say to him, yes, Lord, you know that I love you. Isn't it? And then Jesus said to him, tend my sheep. And Jesus would say to him a third time, Simon, son of John, do you love me? Now Peter was grieved because he had said to him the third time, do you love me? I want to pause here again. Peter denied Jesus 3 times. And what did Jesus just do? He engaged with Peter's story and he restored him 3 times over. And he said to him, this being Peter, Lord, you know everything. You know that I love you. And Jesus said to him, feed my sheep. Truly, truly, I say to you, when you were young, you used to dress yourself and walk wherever you wanted. But when you are old, you will stretch out your hands, and another will dress you and carry you where you do not want to go. And this he said to show by what kind of death he was going to have to glorify God. And after saying this, he said to him, follow me. Now I want you to notice a couple of key things in that chapter. One, that Jesus called him Simon Peter, or Simon, son of John. Instead of the name he gave him chapters earlier, Peter, Petros. He called him by his first name, showing that he knew where he had come from. He engaged his story. He engaged where he had been before. And in verse 15, again he says more than these, referring to his appearance, to the trauma, and to the things that held him down, that shamed him. And finally, Jesus restores Peter's trauma 3 times. After asking him 3 times, do you love me? He redeemed the 3 times that he denied him in his story. And I want to say that Jesus meets us in the same way. That he wants us to engage our stories and engage our traumas with kindness. Not accusation, not shame, not by calling it for what we used to be, but calling it for who he calls us to be. Not just Simon, son of John, who we used to be, but Peter, Petros, upon the rock which we will build our church. Who he called us to be is who he wants us to know that we are stepping into. And secondly, or a third point I would like to add, is to begin to repair your story, to begin to repair your trauma. And in order to do this, we have to be able and willing to engage our trauma, which can be difficult. And I don't want to downplay that, because it was difficult for Peter to forgive himself, to redeem himself from just the one mistake that he caused in saying, I do not know the man, regarding Jesus. But it's also difficult for us to engage in our story. There are parts of our story and parts of our lives where we'd rather not go and dive into. There are parts of our traumas where we've been hurt so bad that we'd rather just avoid it and walk away, saying, no, not me. That's not traumatic enough. I wasn't across the world, abandoned by my father, orphaned and forced to take care of my family. I wasn't in some type of dictator society, being oppressed and sent to concentration camps. Those people have trauma, not me. But I also want to say that even for the minute parts of your story, the ones that may not seem significant in comparison or may not seem like they have caused trauma, the things that cause you to fight with people at 2, 3 in the morning saying, I don't know, leave me. The things that have caused so much strain in relationships that you just want to leave and that have caused breakage and so much hurt where it shouldn't have. Or the things that might even call a little pup like this to be scared of his owners leaving him just because he was abandoned by his first owners. Those things are important. You might not see them as big, but they are important to you because they wounded you. That's what trauma does. So it's important that we are able to openly look at that and say, yes, that did hurt me. Yes, that did traumatize me in some way. And I want to encourage you by saying that once you engage your story, that God is still the God that met with Peter. Jesus is still the God who in Psalm 34:18 says, the Lord is near to the brokenhearted and saves the crushed in spirit. And later on in Matthew chapter 11, verses 28 through 30, he says, come to me, all who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and lowly in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light. This is still Jesus. This is the Jesus that wants to say, yes, I know where you're coming from. I know your story. I know you're hurt. I know what you did, even if it was self-inflicted. But it hurt you. I'm here to say that I'm not looking at that. I'm looking at who you are. I'm looking at who I called you to be. And that is not your past, Simon, son of Jonah. But who you are is Peter Petros. And I call you to be different. So to engage our stories, we have to be willing to look into it and be able to realize that this is where we're hurting and to let Jesus walk in and restore it the way he did with Peter. And I also want to say that Jesus, of course, can know this because he suffered tremendous trauma and tremendous pain, especially during his last hours on the cross. Beforehand, he would be whipped, beaten, abused, mocked, betrayed by all he trusted. Not one was left besides his mother, besides the disciple who Jesus loved. All of his disciples would leave. And then, And I want to conclude with that's the same Jesus who knows your story, who knows your trauma, who knows your hurt. So the Lord is near to all who call on him, to all who will call on him in truth, especially regarding your trauma. So come to Jesus, let him engage and restore you, and be willing to move past it. Thank you.